Dylan arrived at the beach house carrying a weight that could not be seen in his hands or measured in the few bags he brought with him, a weight made of memory, regret, and moments he replayed too often in the quiet hours before sleep. The ocean greeted him with a steady rhythm that felt almost forgiving, its endless movement offering the illusion that time could wash things clean if one stood still long enough. He had come to Will and Electra not because he believed his past could be undone, but because he needed a place where it might finally loosen its grip. The beach house, with its salt-stained windows and open doors that let the wind wander freely through the rooms, seemed like a promise of something simpler. A life stripped of sharp edges and judgment. Dylan told himself that he was there to heal, to learn how to breathe without flinching, to become someone who could live with what he had done rather than constantly running from it. Will welcomed him with a familiarity that made Dylan's chest tighten. Their friendship had been forged long before either of them knew how complicated life could become, back when loyalty was uncomplicated and love had not yet demanded sacrifices. Will's presence was steady, grounding, and Dylan clung to it more than he realized, grateful for the way Will treated him not as a broken thing, but as someone still worth trusting. Electra, too, opened the house and her heart without hesitation. She had always possessed an effortless kindness, the kind that did not announce itself or demand recognition. To Dylan, her warmth felt like sunlight after a long winter, gentle and disarming, and he found himself relaxing in her presence in ways he had not expected. At first, their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of waves and the smell of coffee drifting through the house. Afternoons were spent in shared silence or casual conversation, each of them occupying the same space without demanding too much of one another. Evenings brought meals cooked together, laughter that felt tentative at first and then slowly grew more natural. Dylan told himself that this was what peace looked like: simple routines, familiar faces, and the absence of accusation. He did not notice, at least not consciously, the way his attention lingered a moment too long on small details, or how the intimacy of shared living blurred boundaries he believed were firmly in place. The closeness was subtle, creeping in through unguarded moments. Dylan found himself noticing the way Electra listened when he spoke, truly listened, her gaze steady and open, never flinching when he alluded to darker chapters of his life. She did not press him for details or offer hollow reassurances. Instead, she let him speak at his own pace, her silence a form of respect that soothed something raw inside him. Her presence made his guilt feel less suffocating, as though it could be examined rather than hidden. He mistook that relief for gratitude, unaware that emotions rarely remain neatly categorized when they are fed daily. Will, meanwhile, began to feel the first unsettling shifts within himself. Watching Dylan slowly emerge from his shell stirred something deeper than concern. Will had always been protective of Dylan, but now that protectiveness took on a different texture, threaded with empathy that bordered on intimacy. He saw how Dylan struggled to forgive himself, how the weight of his past bent his posture and haunted his eyes, and Will felt an ache he could not easily dismiss. It was not romantic desire, not yet, but it was more than friendship. It was a pull toward understanding, toward being the person Dylan leaned on when the night grew too quiet. Electra remained blissfully unaware of the undercurrents forming around her. She saw the beach house as a sanctuary, a place where love, in all its forms, could coexist without complication. Helping Dylan felt natural to her, an extension of who she had always been. She believed deeply in the possibility of redemption, in the idea that people were more than their worst mistakes. In her mind, there was no risk in offering compassion. She trusted Will implicitly, confident in the foundation they had built together over years of shared dreams and unspoken promises. The thought that anything could threaten that stability never crossed her mind. Yet tension has a way of announcing itself even when no one names it. It appeared first in glances that lingered a beat too long, in silences that stretched uncomfortably before someone filled them with casual words. Will caught himself watching Dylan when he thought no one noticed, his concern shading into something more charged. Dylan, in turn, became increasingly aware of Will's attention, finding both comfort and confusion in it. He told himself that Will's intensity was born of loyalty, that he was projecting meaning where there was none. Still, a quiet awareness settled between them, unspoken but undeniable. The house itself seemed to absorb their unease. Rooms that once felt open and welcoming now carried an undercurrent of expectation, as though the walls were listening. Even the ocean, once a source of calm, began to mirror their emotional turbulence, its waves crashing harder on nights when sleep refused to come. Dylan spent long hours walking the shore alone, grappling with feelings he did not fully understand and feared to confront. He had come seeking peace, not complication, and yet his heart felt more restless than it had in years. Will's inner conflict intensified as days turned into weeks. His loyalty to Electra had always been a given, a constant he had never questioned. She was his partner, his anchor, the person with whom he had envisioned a future. Yet alongside that certainty grew a new, unsettling truth. His connection to Dylan had evolved into something that demanded acknowledgement. It was not simply attraction, it was a sense of recognition, as though Dylan saw parts of him that Electra never needed to. That realization filled Will with guilt, because it suggested a fracture in his own sense of self. He prided himself on honesty, on being someone others could rely on, and now he felt as though he was betraying those values simply by harboring feelings he had not chosen. Electra continued to move through her days with openness, her kindness unguarded. She encouraged Dylan to speak about his past, gently affirming his worth even when he struggled to see it himself. In doing so, she inadvertently deepened the emotional bonds that were forming, unaware that her generosity was creating a space where lines blurred rather than held. She noticed changes in Will, of course his distracted silences, his occasional distance, but attributed them to stress or concern for Dylan. The possibility that his heart might be shifting never occurred to her, because love to Electra was built on trust. The evening that altered everything began quietly, like so many others. The three of them sat on the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in muted shades of orange and violet. The conversation drifted naturally toward memory, the kind of reflective mood that twilight invites. Dylan spoke more freely than he ever had, perhaps lulled by the sound of the waves or the illusion of privacy that the vastness of the sea provided. He talked about the choices that had haunted him, the moments he wished he could rewrite, and the loneliness that followed him even into crowded rooms. As he spoke, Will felt something shift irreversibly inside him. Dylan's vulnerability stripped away the last of his defenses, revealing a depth of feeling he could no longer deny. In that moment, his concern transformed into something unmistakably intimate. The realization struck him with both clarity and fear, because it left no room for rationalization. He cared for Dylan in a way that went beyond friendship, in a way that demanded honesty, even if that honesty threatened everything he had built with Electra. Dylan sensed the change before Will found words for it. There was something in Will's expression, a rawness that mirrored his own, and it unsettled him deeply. Dylan had spent so long believing himself unworthy of love that the idea of being the object of it felt both intoxicating and terrifying. He did not want to be the catalyst for pain, did not want to fracture the life Will shared with Electra. Yet he could not deny the connection he felt, the sense that in Will's presence he was seen not as a sum of his mistakes, but as someone capable of being loved again. The conversation faltered, heavy with things left unsaid. Electra noticed the tension then, finally aware that something intangible had shifted. She felt it in the air, in the way Will avoided her gaze, and Dylan seemed suddenly guarded. A quiet unease settled in her chest, though she could not yet name its source. She told herself that she was imagining it, that fatigue and emotion were playing tricks on her. Still, as they returned to the house, she felt as though she were walking into unfamiliar territory. That night, sleep eluded all three of them. Will lay awake, wrestling with the knowledge that he stood at a crossroads. He could choose the safety of what he knew, the life he had planned with Electra, and bury the feelings he had developed for Dylan. Or he could risk everything, acknowledging a love he had never anticipated and stepping into a future that promised both exhilaration and heartbreak. Neither choice felt clean. Loyalty pulled him in one direction, authenticity in another, and he feared that any decision would leave scars. Dylan, too, lay awake, his thoughts spiraling. He questioned his right to feel anything at all, haunted by the belief that his presence alone had already caused harm. The idea that Will might care for him in a deeper way filled him with a cautious hope he did not trust. He had learned, painfully, that hope could be dangerous, that it could lure one into believing in possibilities that ultimately shattered. Yet despite his fear, he could not deny the sense of connection that had formed, the feeling that with Will he might finally have a chance at something honest. Electra spent the night confronting a growing sense of displacement. The house that had felt like a sanctuary now seemed charged with secrets. She replayed the evening over and over, searching for the moment when things had changed. A creeping suspicion took hold, not yet fully formed but persistent enough to keep her awake. She did not want to believe that the intimacy she had fostered had become a threat to her own relationship, and yet she could not ignore the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a revelation. In the days that followed, the tension became impossible to ignore. Conversations were careful, guarded, each of them acutely aware of the fragile balance they were trying to maintain. Will found himself avoiding Dylan one moment, seeking him out the next, unable to settle into any version of himself that felt true. Electra noticed the distance growing between her and Will, the subtle ways in which his attention seemed divided, and the realization hurt more than she expected. Dylan oscillated between guilt and longing, caught between his desire to step back and his yearning to stay. The beach house, once a place of healing, now felt like a crucible. Every shared space amplified their emotions, every routine charged with unspoken meaning. The future they had envisioned, one of quiet recovery and shared companionship, had fractured into uncertainty. Will knew that he could not continue in this state of limbo, that postponing a decision was itself a choice with consequences. The longer he waited, the deeper the wounds would become. Ultimately, the choice before him was not simply between two people, but between two versions of himself. One was defined by loyalty and familiarity, the other by risk and authenticity. Neither path promised happiness without cost. Will understood that whatever he decided would alter all their lives irrevocably. The question was whether he had the courage to face the fallout, to accept responsibility for the pain his truth might cause. For Dylan, the future at the beach house became increasingly uncertain. He had come seeking peace, but found himself at the center of an emotional storm. He considered leaving, removing himself from the equation to preserve what remained of Will and Electra's relationship. Yet the thought of walking away without acknowledging what had grown between him and Will felt like another form of self-denial, another chapter of running from something that mattered. Electra stood on the threshold of understanding, her faith in the simplicity of love tested for the first time. She sensed that a reckoning was coming, one that would force her to reevaluate not only her relationship with Will, but her own assumptions about trust and generosity. The kindness that had once defined her now felt vulnerable, exposed to misinterpretation and betrayal. As the days unfolded, one truth became clear to all three: the life they shared could not continue unchanged. The beach house, with its sweeping views and endless horizon, had become a symbol of both refuge and risk. What awaited them was uncertain, charged with possibility and loss in equal measure. Whether it would lead to painful separation or the birth of a new, unexpected relationship remained to be seen. What was certain was that none of them would emerge unaltered. The waves would continue to break against the shore, indifferent to their turmoil, while within the walls of the house, loyalty, love, and identity hung in fragile balance, waiting for a choice that could no longer be postponed. The breaking point did not arrive with a scream or a confrontation, but with a silence so dense it felt heavier than any shouted accusation could have been. Electra's anger had been building quietly, fed by days of half-truths, sidelong glances, and the unmistakable sense that something precious had been slipping from her grasp while she stood inside the very house meant to protect it. What wounded her most was not simply the possibility that Will's heart had shifted, but the realization that her own kindness had become the soil in which the betrayal had grown. She had opened the door to Dylan believing in healing, believing in redemption, believing that love multiplied when it was shared generously. Now she saw that generosity reflected back at her as naivety, and the shame of that realization burned hotter than jealousy ever could. Electra began to replay every moment with Dylan through a different lens. His quiet gratitude, once endearing, now felt calculated. His vulnerability, once moving, now seemed selective, revealed at just the right moments to draw Will closer. She hated herself for thinking this way, for turning compassion into suspicion, yet the pattern felt undeniable. The house that had once echoed with calm now pulsed with tension, every room a reminder that she was no longer the center of Will's emotional gravity. Even when he tried to reassure her, his words felt delayed, as though they had been filtered through another presence before reaching her. Will sensed the change in Electra before she ever named it. Her movements grew sharper, her patience thinner, her eyes no longer resting on him with the same unguarded trust. He wanted to confess everything, to lay bare the confusion in his heart, but fear held him back. He told himself that time would soften the edges, that feelings left unspoken might eventually fade. That hesitation, born of a desire to protect everyone involved, only widened the gap. Each moment of delay became its own form of betrayal, and Electra felt it acutely. Dylan, for his part, tried to withdraw. He recognized the danger he posed, the way his presence had destabilized a balance he never meant to disrupt. Guilt resurfaced with a vengeance, reminding him that wherever he went, damage seemed to follow. He considered leaving the beach house quietly, disappearing before anything irreparable occurred. Yet each time he prepared to go, Will's unspoken pull held him in place. Dylan told himself he owed Will honesty, that running away would only repeat old patterns of cowardice. He did not realize how close Electra already was to the edge. The night it happened, the air was thick with humidity and unexpressed emotion. The ocean roared louder than usual, its relentless rhythm echoing the storm inside the house. Will had gone for a walk, hoping distance might bring clarity. That left Electra and Dylan alone, the silence between them stretched taut by everything they had avoided saying. Electra watched Dylan move through the room, saw the way he hesitated as if aware that something was wrong but unable to name it. In that moment, all the restraint she had been practicing collapsed under the weight of accumulated pain. She confronted him without preamble, her words sharp and trembling, demanding answers she already suspected. Dylan tried to respond with calm, insisting that he had never intended to hurt her, that whatever existed between him and Will had grown without design. His honesty, offered too late, only fueled her rage. To Electra, it sounded like justification, like an attempt to soften the truth without denying it. The idea that something just happened felt like the cruelest lie of all, because it erased her agency entirely. As the argument escalated, Electra's emotions spiraled beyond control. Years of being the understanding one, the forgiving one, the woman who absorbed pain so others could feel safe, surged to the surface all at once. She felt cornered, humiliated, stripped of the narrative she had built about herself and her relationship. Dylan's presence, his very existence in that moment, became a symbol of everything she was losing. Her anger was no longer directed at him alone, but at the version of herself she believed had been foolish enough to let this happen. The act itself was sudden, almost unreal. There was no prolonged struggle, no dramatic choreography, only a brief, catastrophic lapse where emotion eclipsed reason entirely. When it was over, the silence that followed was absolute. Electra stood frozen, the weight of what she had done crashing down on her with delayed force. Dylan lay motionless, the life that had sought redemption extinguished in a moment that could never be undone. Reality reasserted itself slowly, brutally. Electra's anger dissolved into horror as she understood the finality of her actions. The man she had once wanted to save, the man whose presence had challenged her assumptions about love and loyalty, was gone by her hand. The room felt unbearably small, as though the walls were closing in, trapping her with the consequences of her choice. She realized with sickening clarity that nothing, no explanation, no remorse would ever restore what had been lost. When Will returned, the truth confronted him before words ever could. The sight shattered him, collapsing every unresolved feeling into a single, overwhelming wave of grief and disbelief. He struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the act she had committed, to understand how fear and rage had transformed into something lethal. His loyalty fractured in that instant, torn between the devastation of losing Dylan and the impossible knowledge that Electra, too, was now lost to him in a different way. The aftermath was defined by shock and irreversible change. The beach house, once a refuge, became a crime scene, its beauty forever stained by what had occurred within its walls. Electra retreated inward, consumed by remorse and terror, her identity splintering under the weight of guilt. Will faced a future he had never imagined, one shaped by loss, betrayal, and the haunting realization that silence and hesitation had played their own role in the tragedy. In the end, Dylan's death did not resolve the tension that had brought them to this point. It amplified it, scattering the consequences outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Love, once a source of healing, had become a catalyst for destruction. And as the waves continued to crash against the shore, indifferent to human suffering, one truth lingered with unbearable clarity. The choices they had avoided had chosen for them, leaving behind a devastation that would define the rest of their lives.